the NFL draft, it's just this intense spotlight, isn't it? Young athletes under the
Ooh,
microscope.
totally. Every move, every word analyzed, their whole future kind of hangs there.
It's incredibly high stakes. And today we're going to dive into, well, a really specific and kind of controversial moment from this year's pre-draft stuff.
Yeah, we're looking at a report about Shedeur Sanders and his private visit with the New York Giants.
Oh.
It got interesting.
Okay. So for you listening, our mission here is to get past the usual headlines,
Right. We want to dig into how these teams evaluate quarterbacks, especially when it gets a bit unconventional. This whole Giant situation is a perfect example. We're pulling from a really good YouTube discussion that broke it down.
Let's get straight to it then. The core report. This came from Albert Breer, I believe.
Yeah, Breer reported that Sanders left that Giants visit feeling, and this is the word used, pissed.
Wow. Okay, not exactly the vibe you want after meeting a top prospect.
Not ideal, no.
Okay.
And the reported reason is where it gets fascinating. Apparently, the Giants gave him play installations.
Like pages from their playbook?
Exactly. But they deliberately put mistakes in them. Errors. On purpose.
Seriously, why would they do that?
Well, the idea, presumably, was to see if Sanders would spot these intentional mistakes. He didn't, apparently.
Ah.
And then they called him out on it. And he was upset, reportedly, because, well, they didn't tell him beforehand that they were basically setting traps.
Okay, I can see why he'd be annoyed. Now, this whole tactic, the YouTube source we looked at really got into this.
Yeah, one of the speakers was like, okay, teams need to do their homework, obviously. Due diligence is key.
Sure, you got to kick the tires.
But they really question this specific method. They ask something like, what are you actually proving by purposely putting mistakes in there? Especially for a rookie.
That's a fair question. Like, what tangible insight does that give you compared to, say, watching his game film?
Exactly. And that was the counterpoint someone else on there made. They really hammered on Sanders' actual performance. You know, what he did at Jackson State, what he did at Colorado.
Right, the tape doesn't lie, usually.
Their point was, we know what you get with when he plays the game of football on Sunday. We've seen it. Why focus so much on this kind of mental gotcha game?
Yeah, and they were pretty blunt about that potential disconnect, weren't they? Between film room smarts and actual play.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
There's that quote, something like, they sorry as hell can't play a lick ball, but they're great. Great in the film room, great drawing up plays. But come Sunday at 1, they're horrible.
That's putting it mildly. It definitely makes you wonder if some teams maybe overvalue that classroom stuff.
It really does.
Yeah.
And it highlights how different teams might look at the same player. You know, the YouTube discussion also mentioned the Cleveland Browns.
Oh, yeah. What was their take?
Their reported grade on Sanders was like a 4th or 5th round grade.
Whoa, okay. That's quite a contrast to the Giants bringing him in for a private visit, which usually suggests higher interest. Right?
Exactly. So you've got these potentially very different assessments floating around. Maybe it comes down to just different evaluation philosophies.
So let's talk about what's considered like the normal evaluation process for a QB. The YouTube source described it. Sounds intense.
It is. It involves going over play diagrams, route concepts. They mentioned things like red right flank drive, Z motion, the drive route, really specific stuff.
So testing their pure football knowledge, their grasp of X's and O's.
Right. And understanding where the ball needs to go against different looks, different fronts, different coverages. Can they read the defense? Can they process the play?
Makes sense. It's about the mental side of the game.
And a big part of that usually is recall. They'll show a quarterback a play, maybe talk through it, and then ask him to draw it up on a whiteboard from memory.
Okay. Testing if they absorbed it, if they understand the assignments.
Yeah, not just remembering lines, but grasping the why, the progressions, the reads based on the defense. That's pretty standard.
So that kind of test, the drawing on the board, that feels like a legitimate assessment of football intelligence.
I think most people would agree, yeah.
But this Giants thing, putting in errors, that feels like a step beyond testing knowledge. It's almost testing something else. Personality, reaction.
It's definitely a deviation. That's the crux of it. Why go down that road? Why risk, pissing off a potential draft pick?
Was there any comparison made to how defenses are taught or analyzed?
Yeah, actually, the YouTube discussion used a good analogy. They talked about defensive schemes, like the bear defense, covering the center and guards.
Okay.
And variations like the bear stretch, maybe shifting guys over the tight end or outside linebacker to dictate matchups. The 85 Bears, Buddy Ryan. That kind of strategic depth.
Right, so assessing understanding of core football strategy, offense or defense, that seems normal.
That's the typical benchmark, understanding those concepts.
Which brings us back to the Giants and Sanders. What was the goal with the mistakes? Were
Yeah.
they testing his attention to detail,
Yeah.
his willingness to question authority? It's unclear.
Very unclear. And you contrast that with what we do know about Sanders from watching him play.
Like what?
Well, the point was made in the discussion that he showed incredible poise and patience on the field last year, especially considering his offensive line. Well, they struggled a lot.
Yeah, he was under pressure constantly.
Right. So doesn't that in-game composure, that ability to handle adversity during a play, tell you more about his NFL readiness than a whiteboard test with hidden errors?
That's a really strong point. Classroom smarts versus battlefield awareness, maybe.
Could be. And then there's just the raw talent aspect. The consensus seemed to be, hey, the guy can play.
For sure.
And the idea came up that maybe, if he does slide to that 4th or 5th round, like the Browns supposedly graded him, maybe that adds fuel to the fire.
Gives him that chip on his shoulder,
Yeah.
a little extra motivation.
Yeah, that little fire upon him,
You
as they put it. Sometimes that can be powerful.
And regardless of where he gets drafted, the expectation is he'll get a shot, right, Winnie?
Seems likely.
Yeah.
Talent like that usually finds its way onto the field,
Yeah.
especially if the starter struggles. He'll get an opportunity to show what he can do.
It's interesting, too, how different sports approach this. They briefly mention the NBA draft process.
Yeah, just a quick comparison. Things like agility tests and, back in the day, actual scrimmages.
Right.
The speaker even mentioned their own experience working out for top NBA teams, doing 2-on-2, 1-on-1 drills, more direct, maybe skills assessment in a competitive setting. Different sport, different methods.
So wrapping this up, the whole situation really boils down to this clash, doesn't it?
Yeah, between the traditional ways of figuring out if a QB understands football.
And this more unusual, maybe even adversarial approach the Giants reportedly took with the errors.
And clearly, people have strong opinions on whether that kind of tactic is fair or even useful.
Definitely. It makes you wonder, is there a growing split in the NFL about how best to judge these guys?
Is it about the controlled environment tests, the mental games in an office?
Or is it about what you see on the field, how they actually play, how they handle pressure in a real game, how quickly they learn and adapt?
So the question for you listening is, what do you think matters most? What truly predicts NFL success for a quarterback?
That's the big takeaway thought, is something to chew on.
Absolutely. And now we just kind of watch and see how Shedeur Sanders' career plays out. Wherever he lands, his journey is definitely going to add another layer to this whole conversation.